Audio check, 1, 2. Audio check, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Day 12 of the inquiry is resumed. A couple of housekeeping points and some procedural matters. There are 2 weddings today. Again, I think Friday's clearly the day, so there's one at 10 o'clock and there's one at 12 o'clock, so we just need to be mindful of that, please, when we're exiting, if breaks are timed around then. Good news is, should be an early finish today, which is a welcome thing on a Friday. We're just going to have examination in chief of Mr. Williams, which is down for 2 hours. We will have a short break, but hopefully we'll be out of here sort of lunchtime-ish. And then we'll kick off next week with cross-examination. There is room in the timetable for that. There is a draft timetable that if Joanna hasn't already circulated, she will be doing this morning. I'm hoping for an early finish next Friday as well, depending how lively the conditions session goes. But and Inspector Ware has got some other procedural matters to talk about.
Sorry, wrong microphone. Yeah, just a number of housekeeping and procedural matters just to run through. Not in any particular order. The accompanied site visit to the airport itself, we've obviously got the request in for various details from the inspectors, which we will get back as soon as we possibly can. But that accompanied visit will be, and I think we've given the dates before, but it'll be on Thursday, the 26th of August, meeting wherever we're told to meet at the airport at 10 o'clock. But we'll get those details obviously back to the airport along with our various security details. The unaccompanied visit, the site visit, the drive around visit, we've had a very useful map from the council with inputs from various other parties. I know that XR elders have not put into that so far, and that's absolutely fine. I can't offhand remember the deadline that we gave XR elders, but that still stands, and we can obviously take on board any further viewpoints. I would say, though, that what we've got so far is very comprehensive indeed, so I'd be a bit surprised if there's much more to come. But anyway, we've got the map, we've got the schedule, and various comments, which I'm going to come back to in a second. For what it's worth, we'll be doing that on mostly, and I'll explain why, mostly on the Wednesday, the 25th. But we've got that. There was some concern as to whether or not we could manage to get that done in the day. I see the point. I think we can, but the inquiry obviously isn't sitting that week. So if we can't, then we can obviously run it on. There was a request, which we've actually dealt with once before, as to whether we could do the visits on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. As I think I said before, the answer to that is, I'm afraid, no, we can't. And as I said before, we do appreciate that there is never an ideal time to do a visit. If you do it on one day, somebody will always come back with the best will in the world and say, well, it wasn't representative because there were roadworks on the main road or something. So, we are, frankly, very experienced at doing site visits, and we've got a lot of evidence as to traffic conditions and noise levels. So we will be doing that principally on the Wednesday. There was a request on the schedule, but also mentioned yesterday, for us to visit, I think it was a couple of locations that were specified to listen to early morning flights, and we will be doing that. Probably not on that same day, but yeah, 2 of us will be out there at something horrible in the morning, and we will listen to the early morning flights as requested. Also, when running through the schedule, very helpfully identified what the parties thought we ought to be looking at or listening to in various locations. There were quite a number of traffic and highways issues, absolutely fine, but there were a number, 3 or 4 perhaps, where there was a specific reference to rush hour traffic. And so it wouldn't be possible to do that entire loop and hit those places at rush hour. So it'll almost certainly be Mr. Young and myself. We will go back and do those particular locations in the rush hour as a separate exercise, probably a bit later on in the inquiry. So that, I think, is it on the site visits. I mentioned, beginning of the week, I think, the possibility of the Highways Week, which is the bank holiday Monday week, starting on the Tuesday lunchtime. Don't know if people have had the opportunity to consider that.
Yes, sir, we have, and we can accommodate that.
Okay, thank you.
So as far as I'm aware, there's no problem or issues with us on that.
Anyone else who's in the room or indeed virtually have a problem with, I'm getting a shake of the head, with a Tuesday? Okay, well, I'll say it now then. I ought to say the date, but I can't remember it. Have you got the date of? 31st? Yeah. Yeah. Tuesday, we'll start at 12 o'clock. And I think what we'll do is we'll assume by then that everyone's had their lunch, but we'll probably do 2 short breaks during the afternoon. I'll be honest, I've not looked at the timetable for that week, but Inspector Young has, and his view is that it's tight. So I think we need to get that extra time. So yeah, Tuesday, midday start on that one. Couple of other things. We have seen the response by Mr. Brass to Mr. Foley's document, which I think came in yesterday. We've obviously accepted that. We were expecting it. We've accepted it, and it's now an inquiry document. But I would say that that is now it for Fleet Mix. We've had a lot of exchanges, and I'm not complaining about that. But obviously, the Fleet Mix does then knock on to noise and air quality and other things. So that's it. We've now drawn a line under the Fleet Mix comments with that response by Mr. Brass. The only other thing I've got to pick up on, I've seen... Sorry. Got it. Sorry, the joys of having to move your computer around. I've seen a letter from the Department for Transport to the Chief Executive Officer of Bristol Airport, dated slightly anonymously, August 2021, referring back, somewhat amazingly, to a letter that the airport sent in September last year about the possibility of a joint determination. And basically what the letter says, and the covering note makes it even clearer, it's to do with the jurisdiction, and basically the jurisdiction stays as it is, namely, excuse me, namely a Secretary of State decision on the CPO and a transferred decision on the Section 78 appeal. Yes, Mr. Humphreys.
I was going to say, so yes, that's our understanding. We got this, I think, assumed by the same means as others. I noticed at the bottom it was copied to Mark Bolton at the Planning Inspectorate for dissemination. We've assumed, unless you tell us otherwise, that the Planning Inspectorate will disseminate and that that's not a task for us. I think the letter was written to the CEO of the airport because he'd written the request.
Yeah, I mean, other parties probably won't have seen that, but yeah, I was going to ask colleagues at the Inspectorate to circulate that around. It's not an inquiry document, but everybody ought to be aware of it. And it basically, it doesn't change anything. It leaves us exactly where we were, which is with, as I say, with the Secretary of State decision on the CPO, on which we have to write a report, and a transferred decision on the Section 78 appeal. How we're going to do that, and the timing, I'll be honest, I keep trying to think about it, and I can't quite get my head around it for various different reasons, but there is a colleague in the Inspectorate who is sort of working on that and taking advice from the two Secretaries of State. When he has resolved something to his reasonable satisfaction, he'll then come back to us, and I will then float it around the parties, because, as you can imagine, there are a number of issues of timing and prejudice and not boxing the Secretary of State in, which, as I say, I find difficult to understand. But eventually it will be for us to make our decision on how we're going to deal with it and when, but I will take the party's advice on that. But I don't think, effectively, nothing has changed, but that, I think the covering email with that letter, I haven't got it up in front of me, but the covering email to that letter basically says, that's it, the decision is made, please go away. It says it a bit more politely than that, but it was a very clear covering email from DFT saying that that's it, we're not moving further. And certainly from the Inspectorate's point of view, we have tried to change the arrangements and failed, so we'll live with that. Okay, that was it from me.
Okay, are there any other procedural bits from any of the parties this morning? No. Okay. Okay, Mr. Humphreys, over to you. If we break at an appropriate point as well, please.
Yes, just on that, what sort of point would you be looking for? Not that I can necessarily hit it, but...
I mean, after 10:30, sort of 11 o'clock-ish. Miss the wedding as well.
Okay. Thank you. So, Madam, I'll introduce, obviously, Mr. Williams. You should have a proof of evidence from Mr. Williams. There's also a rebuttal,
yeah.
Which you should have as well. I've got it somewhere. And I think there was a summary, but we're not really going to look at the summary. Mr. Williams, sorry, we have to go through this process. Are you Nicholas Williams?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
You have to press that.
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, in section 1.1 of your proof of evidence, you set out your qualifications and experience, and I don't need to go through those in any detail, but you set out there your qualifications. You explain when you joined Bickerdike Allen Partners back in 2008. You explain that the company offers acoustic consultancy services, and one of its specialisms is in relation to aircraft noise, and you also set out your own experience, and that Bickerdike Allen Partners were instructed to prepare the noise chapter of the environmental statement and the environmental statement addendum. Just to perhaps explain to the inspectors, were you involved in that process?
Yes, I was closely involved in the whole process.
And did that include the discussions with the council's officers leading up to the decision?
Yes.
And as far as you were aware, were the council's officers and their then consultants, what were their views about, you know, the methodology, the results, the proposed mitigation conditions that you were that you had undertaken and that were being discussed?
As far as I was aware, our approach was accepted as being reasonable and in line with policy.
And did you discuss conditions with them as well?
Yes, we did.
And how was that left?
Well, I think it's clear to see from the officer's report that conditions were agreed between both parties.
Thank you. Now, we need to just do one thing. I think in your rebuttal, you've noted a typo, which a missing not. I think it's clear from the context that the knot should be there, but can you just take the inspectors to that?
Yes, it's paragraph 4.1.2 of my rebuttal, where I introduce the awakenings assessment. As you say, I think hopefully it was clear from the context, but it should say I do not agree that an assessment of awakenings is required. I mainly mention it because Mr. Taylor kindly pointed it out in evidence in chief of Mr. Fumicelli.
Thank you for just making that correction. I want to go through your evidence in chief in a sort of number of discrete sections, hopefully to help the inspectors. And I want to just start with air noise modelling. And we know that you've used the AEDT model, the FAA's model. Just explain briefly to the inspectors what that model is and why it's appropriate to use it.
Yeah, so when assessing aircraft noise, obviously it's not practical to go and measure at every single person's house for 92 days without pausing. So it's widely common practice to do modelling to produce results that can be used on a large scale. Realistically, there's only really one program that's widely used in the industry. One publicly available program. There's ANCON, as previously mentioned, that is used by the CAA, but they don't make that available to others. So the program that we do use is called AEDT, which is produced by the American equivalent of the CAA, the FAA. And that.
Sorry.
So,
does the use of that model allow you to compare different scenarios, peak mixes, so on, and also compare between one year and another year?
Yes, I mean the model obviously takes as inputs all of the different aspects of aircraft, such as what type of aircraft it is, how many of them there were, what time of day they happened, as in it looks at day and night separately.
Okay, and we have obviously the model results in terms of the 16 and 8-hour LAQ contours, and we'll look at some of those and the results. But does that modelling, the AEDT modelling, does it have any relationship with some of the other supplementary metrics that we've talked about, SEL, Lmax, L70s, L60s, and those various things?
Yes, I mean all of the metrics are derived from the same model, so they all take the same input data.
And
yes.
I asked Mr. Fumicelli about it. It's entirely accepted that the ADT model is appropriate, but just explain to the inspectors a little bit. You started to a moment ago, but just explain to the inspectors a little bit about the inputs to the model, and again, maybe we can touch on some of the things that seem to be agreed and some of the things that are not agreed. So maybe start with things that are agreed or at least not disputed.
Yeah, so as I said, it takes obviously what type of aircraft it is, how many times it happened, what time period it was, whether it's an arrival or departure, which departure route.
Just slow down.
Sorry.
The inspectors want to take a note.
And also, well, the route is also the destination, sorry, which helps to estimate the takeoff weight of the aircraft, because that, well, as has come up before, they essentially, if they're going further, they need more fuel, which means they're heavier, so they use a higher thrust.
Yes. A small point that came up with actually Mr. Vaughan yesterday, and then one of the PCAA witnesses in the first week, about terrain surrounding the airport. Can you just explain to the inspectors what the model does in relation to surrounding terrain?
Yes, so the model, as well, it's an option, you don't have to do it, but it's good practice too, and we have in this case, you put in essentially the ground height of the surrounding area, and so it accounts for that, as in simple terms, if the airport's higher than the surrounding area, the noise will be quieter, and vice versa, because the aircraft will be closer or further from the ground.
And you were talking about times day, night, you put in arrivals, departures, and so on. What about destinations?
Yeah, so I possibly touched on this already, but the destination is used to estimate the take-off weight of the aircraft.
Of course, you did say that. Now again, one or two questions have been asked about validation of the model, and I want to ask you first about validation in terms of the individual aircraft types. So how does the model work? What's the sort of default, and then if you want to calibrate more closely, what do you do?
Yeah, so the model itself has an inbuilt library of data for different aircraft types, and this covers all the major aircraft types, but not obviously every single aircraft type in the world. In particular, very new ones aren't always included straight away, and when you get down to kind of very small general aviation aircraft, there's a lot of different ones, and they don't always have robust data because they're not subject to the same scrutiny.
And so in that default library, what would be what goes into the the library, as you called it?
Obviously so do you mean, how do we use it, or what is it?
AEDT itself, when you say there's a default library, what's in the library?
So that uses noise level data that is derived from aircraft certification tests, essentially. Right. So it's a standard test.
And then just explain to us, and perhaps just take us to some examples of how you've looked for some aircraft types at the particular circumstances at Bristol to see if they're different, to make sure that the model is operating correctly.
Yeah, so obviously, as I said, all the major aircraft types are included, but a slight caveat is that, for example, an Airbus A320, if you look on the certification database, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different actual variants of that type that are all obviously similar but not identical. So what is standard practice for us, at least, is to, at each airport, you look at the noise levels that what operates at that airport actually make, and compare that with what the model thinks they should be making at the noise monitors, and then adjust where appropriate.
So let's look at a couple of examples of this, and I took Mr. Fumicelli to this table, so perhaps we could look at CD 2.5.17. And if you just go to PDF page 89, we can see there two tables, one average measured and default predicted noise levels and validation for arrivals, and the other table on that page is for departures, and you can see there's a noise modification. You can see that sometimes there's a plus and sometimes there's a minus. Just explain in the noise modification column, just explain what's happening there and what that's doing.
So in very simple terms, we predict the noise level that aircraft would have made at the noise monitor, or the noise monitors rather, and then compare that with what was measured and adjust it to minimize any differences.
And what does a plus mean or
So
a minus mean?
a plus would mean that we had to increase the noise level, and a minus would mean that we decreased the noise level compared to the default in the software.
And you've done that there for various aircraft types. And again, I took Mr. Fumicelli to another table at CD 2.20.4. Let's just look at that. I think it's page 10 this time. It says PDF page 10. And again, you have a table there at CD 2.20.4, table 10, measure and default predicted noise levels, validation, and these are for new types, NEOs. And again, is it the same sort of point that you make these adjustments?
Yes, that table is exactly the same process essentially for between the ES and the ES addendum. The Airbus 320 Neo and 321 Neo started operating at the airport, and so we were able to use some real data for them.
And is we can see there are adjustments. Is the ADT model its standard library? Is it far out?
No, I think if you look in the noise level modification column, the large majority of values are less than 1, indicating that actually the default model is fairly accurate to start with.
And Mr. Fumicelli perfectly properly raised a point that, for reasons that are probably well known in relation to difficulties with the model, the Boeing 737 MAX has not been operating in a way that's allowed calibration in this way. Is there any reason to believe that the ADT model will be particularly wrong in relation to that model?
No, I mean, as you say, I don't think it's operated at Bristol at all yet, because there's been well-known reasons for delays. You would expect a similar sort of correction. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily expect a zero correction, but it's unlikely to be of a large magnitude.
And what does all that tell us generally about the kind of robustness of the model and its outputs?
That you would expect it to give you a close result to what you might measure on the ground.
And Mr. Vaughan yesterday raised a slightly different point, which is, look, why don't you model the contour outputs against individual monitoring points? Why typically is that not done?
Firstly, I think it's possibly a slight misunderstanding of how it works, in that the individual aircraft noise levels are essentially added together to make the LEQ. So it's kind of the same thing anyway. And obviously we look at all of the main aircraft types that operate the most and are the noisiest and would have an effect on the resulting noise contours. It's not standard practice to look at the long-term LEQ at the noise monitor. Except that may not be true in this case, but at some airports the noise monitors have some background noise, which means you can't always directly compare the measured level with the level produced by the aircraft. And so there's no real reason to look at it.
Thank you. Apart from just raising the query about the 737 MAX, the other point that Mr. Fumicelli made related to Mr. Foley's fleet mix, and he makes the point in his evidence that which was based on the original fleet mix, that probably led to contours being I think he said 50% larger than we have forecast. Firstly, your comment on that was in his paragraph 6.100. Don't need to go to it.
Yes, I mean, I think clearly Mr. Foley's fleet mix would result in larger contours. I think that was the main point of him producing it. But I don't think it would be anywhere near as much as 50% larger.
And then
Well,
we also have, things have slightly moved on, and Mr. Foley produced a revised fleet mix, and I think you've been asked to produce a note on that. I don't think you have produced a note yet, but on Mr. Foley's revised fleet mix, what's your sort of judgment at the moment about the resulting contour from that?
I think, well, as I said, it would undoubtedly be larger than our core case that was assessed in the ES addendum. It would be smaller than the currently permitted, but would exceed the proposed limits, so would be unlikely to actually occur in practice, or wouldn't occur in practice if the proposed limits are put in place.
I want to move on then to now a different topic. So we've talked about air noise modelling. And I want to talk now about criteria of significance. And we know from your evidence that you, as part of judging significance, you look at two things. You look at absolute levels, lols and sols, and you also look at change in exposure. And I want to then just get you to deal with each of these. So, firstly, absolute levels, lols and sols, and we know those come from the noise policy statement for England, CD 10.4. Just explain first what role do the lols and sols play here in assessing EIA significance?
So they've been used, in terms of assessing significance of the development, they've been used based on policy in the Planning Practice Guidance for Noise, which is CD 10.40, which in simple terms states that at higher noise levels you might need a smaller change to consider something a significant change.
And the MPSE is, and the lols and sols, we know because of the three policy aims, there's also a relationship with the policy response, the mitigation response, if you like, to noise at certain levels. Again, just touch on that briefly, please, for the inspectors. I think they're familiar with it now, but how does that work? Noise above lol, noise above sol?
Yeah, well, it's probably been through before, so I'll try and be brief, but in simple terms, above the lull, the policy guidance is to mitigate and minimise. And then as you go above the sol, the policy guidance is to avoid those effects from occurring.
Yes, and the PPG introduces a higher level again, the UAEL, and we saw from the noise hierarchy table there the sort of single word response is prevent.
Yes, and that's why typically airports would offer to buy someone's house in simple terms if they're above that level, although there's none here at Bristol. So.
No. All right. So let's just talk then about, firstly, the lols. So lowest observed adverse effect level, and it may help the inspectors if we just pull up the table that sets out all the lols and sols. So if you go to CD 2.20.1 and you turn to page 70, you get a table 6.3, where we can see various different subjective descriptors, including lulls and sols and UAELs. I always say UAELs, I don't know how you pronounce that otherwise, so I'm going to stick with UAELs. Just starting with lulls, just explain to the inspector, what's agreed between you and Mr. Fumicelli in terms of lulls and what's not agreed.
For lulls, I believe Mr. Fumicelli has agreed that the 51 dB is appropriate for the daytime, but he's not agreed the nighttime level.
So the 51 is agreed, and the 45 is not agreed.
Yes.
So we don't really need to discuss the 51. So let's discuss the 45. So your position is there that 45 is the lull for nighttime, the LAQA tower. What is Mr. Fumicelli's position on that?
He has stated he believes it should be 40 dB.
And just before commenting on what he says, just explain where have you got the 45 from? What's the justification for that?
Well, for the lull, the justification for both daytime and nighttime is that the government has set out its policy in the consultation response on UK airspace policy, which is CD 10.43, I believe.
Let's just look at that. So 10.43. So this is the Department of Transport's consultation response on UK airspace policy framework for balanced decisions. And where do we need to go in that document?
So it's on my screen, it's page 19 of the PDF, paragraph 2.72.
19. And paragraph 2.72, and we can see there, so this section I think is under the heading further up the page, government response, and actually if I just take you back in the document to the previous page set out the question, didn't it, 2B, question 2B, please provide your views on proposed assessment of impacts, noise, including on health and quality of life. And paragraph 2.62 said using a lull was broadly supported in principle as part of the broader risk-based approach assessment. The specific daytime and nighttime values proposed for the lull also received broad support. Some welcome these values, that these values are consistent with WHO, while others felt they did not align completely. So there was clearly a discussion about that, and then we get to the government's response at 2.72. What's the response? What's the government's position on this?
So the key text is the bold part of that paragraph. They quite clearly state, we will set a lull at 51 dB LAQ 60 now for daytime, and based on feedback and further discussion with CEA, we're making one minor change to the lull night metric to be 45 dB LAQ 8 hour, rather than L night, to be consistent with the daytime metric.
And so we can see where you've got that from, just so that we kind of understand the status of this. If we go in the document back slightly to PDF page 8, PDF page 8 and we look at paragraph 9, it says there the government's current aviation policy is set out in the aviation policy framework. The policies set out within this document provide an update to some of the policies on aviation noise contained within the APF and should be viewed as the current government policy. So what do you understand government policy to be in relation to that nighttime lull, the 45 dB?
I understand government policy is that it should be, that is what government policy is, that the lull should be 45 dB at night.
And how does this lull, the 45 dB nighttime lull, compare with assessments at other airports, particularly post, obviously, this guidance?
It's, as far as I know, what's always been adopted, or certainly in almost all cases, if not all.
And then I just want to examine with you Mr. Fumicelli's position that's wrong, and that the lull should be set at 40 dB. And we know he, in part, bases that on WHO and the WHO 2009 document that we have as CD 10.44. Perhaps we ought to just look at that. This is the night noise for Europe document. And again, can you just explain to the inspectors what that says and whether that changes the position vis-à-vis the UK?
Well, the 2009 WHO document did identify 40 dB hour night as where effects might start to occur, but I think it's clear that the government had considered this in setting its policy, and so that should be given greater weight than the WHO.
And another point that I understood Mr. Fumicelli to be making was that here, because this is an airport in a rural location, there may be lower background noise levels, and that means one should have a lower nighttime lull. Whilst we're still in 1044, can we just go to page 12? And I think, sorry, this is where the PDF pages are completely wrong, so we need to go to actual page 12, which, when I've scrolled through, I think is PDF page 32. And we can see the section 1.3.6. And again, what should we draw from this? I think it may be one of the passages I took Mr. Fumicelli to, but what should one draw from this in relation to background noise?
I think there's a general acceptance when assessing aircraft noise that the background noise just isn't really relevant, because when an aircraft goes over, whether you're in a rural location or in a town, it's not masked by the background noise. It's sometimes a mistake that people make to compare a background noise of 50 LEQ with an aircraft noise level of a similar number, but that misses the point that when the aircraft is actually there, it's a higher noise level. And I think that the text here tries to make that point, saying that in the, I think it's the third paragraph on that section, if you ignore the bullet points, it says, even a relatively continuous motorway of 50 dB cannot mask aircraft noise of 30 dB, because this might be composed of, for example, 5 aircraft at an Lmax of 57.
So what should the inspectors draw from that in terms of needing to adjust the lull because of the airport being in a rural area and having lower background noise levels?
I don't think there's any need to adjust for background levels.
And again, just to see what the WHO has said in other reports, could we have out the WHO guidelines for community noise, and that's CD 10.1. And in that document, go to PDF page 30. And again, we have a paragraph there headed 2.3.4, influence of ambient noise levels. And again, what's the, it's dealing with, amongst other things, flyover noise. What's the advice in relation to flyover noise as opposed to ambient?
Yes, just for clarity, ambient noise level and background noise level are interchangeable in this context. I mean, it states, obviously, well, I might as well read it out. A number of studies have suggested that the annoyance effect of a particular noise would depend on how much that noise exceeded the level of ambient noise. This has been shown to be true for noises that are relatively constant in level, and it gives a reference, but this has not been consistently found for time-varying noises such as aircraft noise, because at some time during the aircraft flyover, the noise almost always exceeds the ambient level. Responses to this type of noise are less likely to be influenced by the level of ambient noise.
So, look, in the round, we've looked at the WHO documents on which I understand Mr. Fumicelli relies. Is there anything in that tells you that the UK government policy position of 45 dB is wrong?
No, there isn't.
And so we're still on Lowell's. I think we've touched on this before, but for the inspectors, we know that therefore a noise between Lowell and Seoul, the MPSE gives us a particular response, which I think you said was mitigate and minimize. Is that right? That's
Yes.
And what's that likely to, for an airport, obviously it doesn't just relate to airports, but for an airport, what sort of measures would you be expecting between the Lowell and the Seoul?
So that's normally for an airport that translates to essentially doing everything you can to operate the actual planes as quietly as possible. So engaging airlines to ensure that they're using best practice procedures when departing, and essentially just not making more noise than they need to. And also there may be some offer of insulation, although this is not normally done for the whole of that range, but certainly a number of airports offer insulation to people at the higher end of the range, as in the worst affected.
And we'll come to it later, but we know at Bristol Airport there are existing and proposed a number of conditions, including things like QC limits and things like that. How do those relate to mitigate and minimize?
Yes, so that's another example of how they would seek to ensure that certain noise impacts aren't exceeded, so minimising what happens at night.
And so let's go on to Sol. Again, I don't know whether people still have it open, but CD 2.20.1, if we went back to PDF page 70 and that table we were looking at that summarises the sols and lols, table 6.3, we can see there that the sol that you've adopted for daytime is 63 dB and for nighttime 55 dB. And again, the daytime level, the 63 dB, Mr. Fumicelli's written evidence indeed confirmed in cross-examination is that he agrees that. So both the sol and lol for daytime are agreed, but he's again disagreed on nighttime. So let's again just unpack that and understand. We can see in the table you adopt a position of 55 dB for the nighttime sol. In Mr. Fumicelli's written evidence, he didn't identify a figure, but in his evidence in chief, he identified a figure for 50. So let's just go through the same sort of process. What, in terms of your figure, 55 dB, what's the justification for that, for your figure?
So the main justification for it is the WHO 2009 document that we were looking at earlier, which I think is CD 10.44.
Where should we go in that?
And it's the relevant part is table 3, which is on page. Sorry if you bear with me, I had it a second ago.
Table 3 is PDF page 19, I think.
Yes. Yeah, it's the executive summary XVII. For some reason, my PDF is telling me it's page 165, but it's clearly not. But yes, that table essentially describes the effects that occur at different noise levels, and although they're not identical, but they're broadly in line with the hierarchy table that sets out the lows and sols in the PPG noise.
Yes, this is an important point. So for above 55 dB, the descriptor in that table, I'm not going to read it, it's just a waste of time, but we can see what it says. It includes things like sizable proportion of the population is highly annoyed and sleep disturbed, evidence of risk of cardiovascular. And we know that that there are similar descriptors in the noise hierarchy table. Which descriptor in the noise hierarchy table are you therefore taking us to?
It's the one that is above the sol, so if you just bear with me, I'll bring it up. So it's CD 10.4.1, and if you look at the line below...
10.40.1.
Sorry, 0.40, my mistake. And yeah, so the line below, significant observed adverse effect level, where it says the description is that the noise would be present and disruptive, and the noise causes, well, again, I won't read it all out, but potential for sleep disturbance resulting in difficulty getting to sleep and so on.
And so you've taken that in. Again, how does your use of the 55 dB as the nighttime sol compare with the experience at other airport inquiries?
It's commonly adopted as the sol for nighttime.
And I think in your proof of evidence, there's no need for us to go to it. There was a table where you set out
Yes. I think I set out 4 or 5 other inquiries, and I think most recently Stansted adopted 54 and all of the others adopted 55.
So then let's just examine Mr. Fumicelli's 50 and...
Sorry, Mr. Clark, did you?
Perhaps I can ask if the witness could turn both microphones on. I'm
Okay.
struggling to
Yeah.
hear, sorry.
I'm sorry if that's been a problem.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
I do apologise.
Sorry, I'll try and speak up.
It's a tendency, I think, for all of us to sort of slightly sit back sometimes, and that's not ideal. So Mr. Fumicelli, we know, has suggested in his evidence in chief a threshold of 50 dB as the sole night time. I just want to get your comments on firstly where he gets that from, and then what you say about that. And as I understood it from his evidence in chief and the cross-examination, he seemed to be relying on the sonar night disturbance report, so which we have as INQ 022, and because that came out recently and he only introduced this point in his evidence in chief, not his written evidence, I understood this to be the justification. So just in that document, he took us at one point to a table which he said had a step change threshold, which indicated that 50 dB was the appropriate the appropriate level for the soul. I'd just get you to comment on that.
Sorry, what am I looking at specifically?
Yes, he relied on a table, and for the life of me, I can't.
Okay, was it-
Scanning through it on the screen, I can't quite find.
I think it was this table 14.
Thank you.
Do we have a page?
Page 27.
That's the one. Yes, I've highlighted it, but not written down the PDF page number. Table 14, and then there was also on the next page figure 4. I'm going to write that down for myself. And he pointed there to a step change at around 40 to 48 to 50.9 dB, and he said, well, that represents, therefore, a change which he's interpreted as being a soul. And he said, look, there's a step change in highly sleep disturbed. So just explain to the inspectors if you like, sort of status of this report, and perhaps comment on the particular question that this table is responding to.
I think the report itself, as far as I understand, was aiming to demonstrate correlation between certain metrics and sleep disturbance, rather than to try and determine a level at which sleep disturbance has a step change. And so, in simple terms, it wasn't, the intention of it wasn't to inform policy for a soul. It was to inform what metrics should be used to assess nighttime noise.
And if we turn to, I think it's PDF page 10, in that document, we can see paragraphs 2.20 and 2.21 and 2.22 21 in particular comments on the question that particular table 14, was responding to, can 1 Roman 7, and just, again, there's no need to kind of read it out, the inspectors can read it, but what's the comment on this, and the reliance that should be placed therefore on that table as indicating that there should be a sol of 50 dB?
I think it's important to note that the report itself highlights the fact that it's an exploratory study and was not specifically designed for sleep disturbance investigation. So clearly they don't think the results are that robust enough to be used for policy, would be my interpretation.
All right. So, again, just looking generally at Mr. Fumicelli's justification for a sole nighttime of 50, what's your position overall, having heard his explanation, his justification?
I don't accept that there's the evidence to change from the standard practice of using 55 dB. I think there's much more extensive research that goes into that, and more research would be required to change from it.
And moving on slightly, again, MPSC, you've touched on it before, above a sol, we know that the action is avoid, and again, in practical terms for an airport, what do you do above a sol?
You try to avoid the effects that are associated with that noise level.
And how?
So, particularly at airports, for example, you would, at night time, the obvious solution is to provide insulation and ventilation so that people can still get ventilation in their bedrooms but don't have to open the windows to let the noise in.
So we've talked about lols, and we've talked about sols, which are part of your overall approach to assessing significance. I want now to look at the change in noise level part of that. And again, I'm going to take you to a couple of tables in CD.20.21, sorry, CD2.20.1. And this time on these two tables on page 71. And table 6.6 and 6.7. And 6.6 gives the changes in average noise level and subjective impression and potential impact classification. We can see those 0 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 6, and so on. And then table 6.7 is the table that synthesizes the relationship between the lols and the sols and the changes. Do you see that?
Yes, that's right.
And again, just to explain that to the inspectors, we'll come back and unpack these things, but for lol, in table 6.7, we can see a change of 0 to 2 dB would be a very low magnitude of change, 2 to 3 would be low, 3 to 5 would be medium, 5 to 10 high, above 10 very high. And so you can see there's the very low and low go from 0 to 3. And then if we look, we're looking at air noise and ground noise here, the sol
get very low is 0 to 1, and low is 1 to 2, and then again medium this time is 2 and above, so 2 to 4, 4 to 7, and so on. So what is the threshold in terms of magnitude of effect, very low, low, medium, high, very high? What's the threshold for significance?
So a significant effect, well, a potential significant effect would occur if the magnitude of effect was medium or higher, which I think we state after table 6.7.
Okay. And so you see the relationship between level sol and then change. So let's come to change, and which is table 6.6, and why you've adopted certain levels. So firstly, the 3 dB change, which is the up to 3 dB change, which is the change criterion you're applying above LOL but below SOL. Is that agreed with Mr. Fumicelli?
No, I understand he doesn't agree with the change criteria, although I'm not sure what his position is.
Why, for changes in noise above LOL, why do you adopt a 3 dB threshold as the threshold of significance?
I think there's various places in government policy which I could take you to if you want, but for example...
Why don't you just identify some of those for the inspectors? We don't have to go to all of them, but I think you summarise them actually in your evidence, don't you? So maybe that's a shorthand way of...
I suggest maybe I just read down the references and we don't go to the documents. But for example, in the
Hang on, just where in your...
Sorry, in my proof of evidence, it's paragraph 4.2.44 onwards. I think that's summarised there.
Okay, from that, right, we can see that. So maybe use that as a shorthand so that we don't, we can keep moving on and not slow things down. But there's a reference there in that paragraph to 4.2.44 to the APF, and inspectors can obviously see that. This is on page 42. The next paragraph is a reference to the airspace change consultation response. Again, a reference given. Then in the next paragraph, a reference to Aviation 2050, and a reference given. The next paragraph, a reference to the 3 dB in the AIMA guidelines, and then in the next paragraph, a reference in DMR B. So, in your view, what's the robustness of applying a 3 dB criterion as a change threshold?
So, for example, in the APF and in Aviation 2050, 3 dB is clearly set out as a level of change at which you should be looking to offer insulation. So it seems clear to me that the government considers that level of change to be significant enough that airports should do something about it.
And as far as experience in other airport inquiries is concerned, again, how has the 3 dB threshold been viewed?
There's, in general, 3 dB is always used as a threshold above the lull. Some assessments have used that same threshold above the SOL as well, and others have sought to account for the PPG guidance that there might be a lower threshold above the SOL.
So we know you've used 3 dB above lull. Above SOL you have, as we touched on a moment ago, used a slightly different threshold between 0 and 2. Why have you applied a lower threshold above SOL, and why 2?
So for the why, as touched on before, there's policy justification in PPG noise of why you might look to have a lower threshold at higher noise levels, and equally, if I can take you to the SONA study, well, maybe we don't have to look at it, but essentially they set out numbers of people highly annoyed at different noise levels, and they increase at a faster rate at higher noise levels, which indicates that people at higher noise levels are more sensitive to change.
And so how have you reflected that in your threshold?
So we've taken that into account, and essentially if you look at the numbers and also take into account the fact that, for example, the Cranford inquiry, they examined the issue and found there wasn't enough evidence to say that a 1 dB change was significant. And I think that's quite consistent with the SONA study as well, that essentially 2 dB seems to be about the right difference.
Okay. In relation to this, we know Mr. Fumicelli has not proposed alternative thresholds, either above Lowell or above Sol, so we don't know what he's proposing, but he did, as you've just alluded to, propose 1 dB threshold at the Cranford inquiry. We've got that as your appendix 1 of your main proof. I don't think we need to go to it, but as you've indicated, what was the inspector's considered view?
The inspectors found that, well, they weren't convinced by the arguments that there should be 1 dB should be used as a threshold, and they said they found no policy justification for anything other than a 3 dB change.
I want to move on now slightly and deal with a short section, I hope, that maybe can then take us up to a convenient break. I don't want to go through all the sort of APF policy again in detail. The inspectors can read that and are cross-examined on it and so on. But there are a few points that Mr. Fumicelli made by reference to policy, in particular the APF, that I'd like to just get you to comment on. He made much of the comment in the APF, so CD's 6.1, no need for you to look it up, I think we're familiar with this, but paragraph 3.12, the concept of sharing the benefits, and how should the inspectors, in your view, understand that concept of sharing the benefits? Does that mean, there seem to be implied 50-50, or what does it mean?
As far as I am aware, there's no specific amount of sharing that is specified. I think ultimately it's a planning balance type issue, but there's a clear expectation that some sharing should occur, as in if an airport expands and doesn't reduce any of its limits, then all of the benefit is to the airport and none to the community. And similarly, if an airport doesn't expand but gets quieter over time, all of the benefit is with the community. So I think it's clear the policy expectation is to be somewhere between those two extremes.
And Mr. Fumicelli made the point that one should be comparing with what is permitted, and we know that permitted contour size is 12.42 square kilometres for the 57 dB contour. How with what is proposed by the airport, how to what extent is it sharing against what is permitted?
Yes, as you say, the current daytime limit is 12.42 kilometres squared, and I think there's a current proposal that was agreed with NSC officers as part of the application to reduce that to 11.5. I understand, well, negotiations are ongoing about exactly what the proposal will be for this process, but it will certainly be less than it is now.
And the only other thing I'd just sort of get you to touch on that Mr. Fumicelli particularly drew attention to in some of those policy documents was was the concept of reduce. Do you remember I cross-examined him on his kind of summaries and whether there was an absolute injunction that one has to reduce or whether it was more nuanced than that. Again, how should one understand the high-level objective to reduce noise in the context of airport expansion?
I think that the intention is that the reduction should apply to the limit that is in place at the airport, because clearly if you're just looking at a specific future year, any expansion without some other related step change in fleet mix, for example, will always result in an increase in noise. So if you have an application that's approved, the impacts are deemed to be acceptable, you then reduce from that over time. I think the case here is effectively is that back in 2009, 11, I'm not sure exactly when the assessment was done, or the previous application, they forecast that by the time they got to 10 million passengers, they'd be at about 12.4, and that's why that was set as the limit. Since then, new aircraft have started to come into service, and so now they're likely not to reach that at any point. And found that even going to 12 million, they can sit a reasonable portion below that.
But does that reflect sharing benefits?
To my understanding, yes, it's exactly what the policy expects.
Now, Madam, that would be a convenient break point. I think you said did you say between 10:30 and 11? Or?
Yeah, I did, yes.
And it's almost exactly between 10:30 and 11. That was coincidence, I have to say, but would that be convenient?
That's great. So if we reconvene at 11:05, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, okay, Mr Humphreys.
Manu, if I just address a point to you first. I think I've been going just over an hour. I have to say, I think I'm going to take more than my estimate because we're not particularly time pressured today. I'm not going to take until 3:30. But what I'm trying to do is get the witness to take us or to take you to some of the base tables in the ESA and stuff like that and the things rather than just things in the proof. So I will apologize in advance if we do go over the 2 hours. I think that's perfectly possible, but I hope it's helpful.
Do you have an estimate as to how much more time you might need?
Half an hour, maybe?
Half an hour.
Something like that.
Yeah, okay.
As I say, I'm just very keen that we go to some of these base documents.
Yeah.
Mr. Williams, I want to turn now next to the assessment on the primary metrics. Then I'm going to get you to go through supplementary metrics, the main ones. Then we'll talk about ground noise, and then we'll talk about conditions. But conditions we may be able to take quite briefly, we'll see. So I want to get you first to just focus on the LAQT, the primary metric. Why are these called primary metrics?
Because they're the metrics that should be given the most weight and in any decision-making process, and I think that's clearly set out in government policy and underpinned by extensive research over a long period of time.
One of the criticisms of the LEQT metric, whether 16 hours or 8 hours, is that, as a number of people said, particularly in the first week, people don't hear average noise, and obviously people don't hear average noise, but can you just explain for the inspectors this dose-response relationship, the correlation between all the surveys that have been carried out on people living near airports experiencing real events, and then what that correlates best to and why?
Yeah, I think there's possibly two separate points there. First, I'll deal with this not being what people actually experience. I think it's useful just to explain LAEQT is widely used throughout acoustics, not just in aviation, to mean the average noise level, and it's essentially a logarithmically weighted noise level over time. I won't go into it, but it's slightly different to the arithmetic average and makes it a little bit higher. That's exactly appropriate when you've got a continuous noise source. I think in aviation, historically, there was the noise and number index, which looked at gave more weight to the number of aircraft. That was replaced by LAEQ as being most appropriate in UK policy following a 1982 study. I think everybody involved in it appreciates that aircraft do not give you a continuous noise level over the day, and that they are actually a series of individual noise events. But I think one of the reasons that there's now a recognition in a number of policy and guidance documents that supplementary metrics should be produced, it's because it's quite difficult to comprehend what an LEQ of 57, for example, means to someone who's not familiar with the concept. Because especially nowadays, most people can measure sound on their mobile phone. They'll go in their garden and say it's above 57, therefore I must be in the contour. Something's wrong. You're fiddling the data or something. But the reason that it's used in policy is that there's been extensive social surveys based on the LEQ metric, and it's found to be the best way of aggregating all of these individual noise events, because obviously they're not all the same noise level, they don't all last the same amount of time. People experience them in different ways, but the LEQ is what's been found to correlate best with the response to those noises.
And we know there was sonar research back in the 2014 report and recently the second edition report that we have at INQ 025, and section 8 of that document, we've been to it before, sets out the broad conclusions on those. But you know, having reviewed it, having updated its work on that recently, what's the conclusion on the use of the LAQ 16-hour as a daytime metric?
In the sonar documents, both the previous one and the new version, for both the daytime and the nighttime, they conclude that the LAQ 16-hour or 8-hour is the most appropriate metric to use for assessing the effects of noise.
And again, we've looked at it. There is obviously a correlation with N70 as well. Again, we went through it. We know the LAQ correlation is better than the N70 correlation. In that context, would there be any particular reason to rely principally on the N70 metric rather than LAQ as recommended?
No, I think it's clear that you should rely firstly on the LEQ metric. I think it's also important to note that they're not measuring different effects. They're both measuring, in the daytime, for example, they're both trying to measure annoyance. It's not that you have some effects that are picked up by LEQ and other effects that are picked up by N70 contours. Yes. They're both ultimately just trying to assess how annoyed people are by the aircraft noise. And I think what sonar clearly demonstrates is that LEQ does that the best.
And one of the questions I asked you at the beginning of the cross-examination was, did the AEDT modelling, the LAQ modelling, what was the relationship between that and the N70s? And you said, well, it is that modelling that produces the N70s. So when one's looking at the N70 outputs, is that simply reflecting, is that the same aircraft doing the same movements, creating the same noise as the LAQs?
Yes, that would be a fair summary.
The policy documents, sonar and indeed ICANN, do say that people have difficulty, members of the public have difficulty understanding LAQs, and other supplementary metrics are helpful in helping people to understand the data. Again, just explain to the inspectors, therefore, the role that some of these other metrics, we'll come to them later, but some of these other metrics have as supplementary metrics.
Yeah, so the number above metric, for example, it's if you're in the N70 10 event contour, that means that you're going to be exposed to a noise level of 70 dB, which is, I think, based on being associated with speech disturbance indoors 10 or more, well, more than 10 times a day. And that's quite an easy concept to understand. If you said instead you're going to be in the 60 LEQ contour, people wouldn't immediately know what that means for them. Kind of, would that annoy me or not? Whereas you can, I think most people can say if you're going to have speech interference indoors, that you can understand what that effect would be. So I think they're helpful in terms of explaining the effects, but as has been found, they don't quite correlate with people's actual response quite as well.
So let's just look at some of the contours to show what they, or to see what they show. So we need to look again in the ESA appendix. So that's CD 2.20.4. And I'm going to start by inviting you to look at PDF page 49, which is the 10 MPPA contour in 2024, and then the next one is 12 MPPA in 2030, and then 10 MPPA in 2030. And we start with the first of them on page 49, just so the inspectors can understand the way the contours work. You see a number of concentric contours. The outside one has a 51 on it, and if you look at the legend, it tells you that they go from 51 to 69 in 3 dB steps. So the next one in is 54, and then 57, and 60, 63, 66, 69, and there's a correlation with those thresholds, isn't it, that are used. 57 dB used to be the annoyance contour, it's now 54, 63 a Sol, and so on. Is that why we end up with those step changes?
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of common practice for a long time in the UK to present them in 3 dB steps. As you say, it nicely lines up that a lot of them actually do correspond to levels that we're interested in, shall we say, such as 63 or 57 or 54, and obviously 51 being the lower as the largest one.
So if we want to understand the difference in 2030 between the 12 MPPA case and the 10 MPPA case, we would look up PDF page 50 for 12 MPPA and PDF page 51 for 10 MPPA, and we can see that the contours are slightly different between the two. The 12 MPPA are slightly higher, and as a contour moves out, what will happen within the population numbers as the contour moves out?
Well, I think obviously, unless you're in an area where there aren't any people living, as the contour gets bigger, then it will have more people in it.
But if one was to use the Weston-super-Mare beach analogy, as I remember in the 1960s as a child being here, the sea would seem to go out for what seemed to me to be miles, but wasn't actually miles, but actually wasn't going up and down very much. If the contour moves, but you're in a particular location, for you, how much vertically, how much change is there in noise at a particular location?
Well, obviously, it's not necessarily the easiest to see from the maps exactly how much it changes, but I think if you look between the two, you can see it doesn't get smaller than the next contour, which would be 3 dB. And we know from the analysis in this case that in the daytime, they're changing by less than 1 dB.
Yes. So the contour may move on the map, you may have more people, but the difference to any one person, we'll see later.
Yeah, just to be clear, the contours are the absolute levels. The contours themselves don't illustrate change.
No, exactly, when we come to change in a minute. Okay, so we can see those things. Then let's look at, to illustrate this point, let's look at the tables to understand numbers of people, and then look at other tables to look at change. So what happens at any one point. So let's look at
page 72. Not page 72. Oh, sorry, we need to go to CD 2.20.1, page 72. And table 6.8, and the Lowell and Sel contours have been looked at there for daytime, and you can see those changes in population because of the changes in the size of the contour we looked at
Yes.
a
Yeah, you
moment ago.
can see, obviously, looking at the number within the Lowell, for example, you can see from 2017 it goes down slightly to 2024, goes down slightly again to 2030 with 12 million passengers, and if there was only 10 million passengers, it would go down more.
And is that a reflection of the size of these contours as they, we saw the way they move as they spread over different
Yes, I mean,
areas?
you won't always have a direct relationship between the area and the people, because obviously people aren't evenly distributed over the place. But
if we want to, the Weston-super-Mare Beach analogy, if we want to understand not how far the tide has gone out, but how far it's risen or fallen for someone standing in a single spot, can we just look at CD 2.20.4, that's the appendices again, and go to page 36. And there we see change, same data, but now change. And what does that tell us, not about the total number of people in a particular contour, but about the change to any individual at a particular location?
so this table essentially sets out we had a different column for the different levels of change, and as you can see, all the people, or all the dwellings rather, are in the first column, indicating a negligible change of 0 to 2 dB.
And for those above the Sol 51, we can see that the number of people who have an adverse effect at that level, and then at the Sol, again, we can see the number of people, the number of beneficial, the number of adverse at those levels, and this one is dwelling, sorry. You're absolutely right, sorry. We can see the number of dwellings, and again, against your criteria, your significance criteria, which is a change of 3 dB above Lowell and a change of 2 dB above Sol, what does that tell us about the EIA significance of the daytime air noise effects using the primary metrics?
Well, as by using the criteria set out in the tables you referred to earlier, it would indicate that there's not a significant effect.
So let's do the same thing now for the nighttime contours. So we can stay in this document, CD 2.20.4, and let's go to page 52. And again, we get the various different contours on that page. This is the 2024 contour in 3 dB steps marked in the different colour there, because it's not a 3 dB step, is the 55 contour. And if we look over the page, the next two, we again see the difference between day and night. Sorry, not between day and night, they're all night. The difference between 12 mppa and 10 mppa in 2030.
Yes, that's what they show.
And again, if we want to look at numbers of people, again, unfortunately, we have to go back to CD 2.20.1. We look at page 73, which is the page that the next page, page 73, from the table we were looking at before, table 6.9. And again, just talk the inspectors through that table, what it shows, and then we'll show, so that's numbers of population within...
Numbers of dwellings again.
Numbers of, thank you, numbers of dwellings within certain contours, and then we'll look at what the change is for an individual in any of those dwellings. So again, just talk the inspectors through that first of all.
Yeah, firstly, just to clarify, this is in the ES addendum where we did a summary just showing the LOL and the cell values that we're most interested in. If the numbers for each of the contour bands presented on the figure are in the appendix. If you choose to, we won't take you to them.
Let's look at these, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So again, it shows that from 2017, you increased slightly, going up to 10 million passengers in 2024, with another small increase up to 12 million. And then if you stayed at 10 million, it would go down.
So we can see the numbers of people within those contours we looked at, but if we want to understand the difference for any individual, we go back to the appendix, CD 22.20.4, and I think we go to page 36. That's not the right table, is it?
I think it's page 37.
It's page 37, yes, I apologise for that. As soon as I looked at it, it didn't look right. It's page CD, PDF page 37, it's table 6A.63. And again, we can see the changes for people which are all within the 0 to 2 dB column. And again, how does that relate to your significance threshold criteria? And what does that tell you then? What are the conclusions about whether these are significant EIA effects?
So, as with the daytime, for dwellings between the LOL and the cell, we would need a change of more than 3 dB to indicate significance, and above the cell, we would need a change of more than 2, and that's not the case for any of the dwellings. So the conclusion is that then the changes are not significant.
Next point I just want to touch on before I go on to supplementary metrics is that from that data, the 16-hour and 8-hour AQ data, it is possible to calculate, and you do calculate, numbers of people highly annoyed and numbers of people sleep disturbed. We'll look at the table in a moment, but very high level, how are those numbers calculated?
So there's a data response table or formula, as for example in the sonar report for the daytime, which gives you a percentage of people that are likely to be highly annoyed at given noise levels. And so we look at the number of people in each band. So for example, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think at 54 dB it's 9%, and so you would multiply the number of people in that band by that percentage. So it's not identifying specific people who are highly annoyed, but it's an overall estimate of how many people would be.
And again, if we want to understand what that data is, if we look at CD 2.20.21 and go to pages, PDF pages 73 and 74, we can see that output data, table 6.10 and table 6.11.
Sorry, Mr. Humphreys, what's the core document reference?
It's the ES addendum, so it's CD 2.20.1.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's PDF pages 73 and 74. And the two tables, just for your note, are table 6.10 and 6.11.
Yeah.
And again, just get you to comment on the two tables. So this is how the primary metrics are used to produce numbers of people highly annoyed and sleep disturbed. Firstly, maybe I should ask you, what then happens to that data? Where is it used? What's it an input to?
It's in terms of the noise assessment, it's not used to indicate significance, but as far as I know, it feeds into the health impact assessment, which
Yes.
obviously will be discussed by Mr. Piper.
So what do the two tables show? And we know from Mr. Piper's evidence that the HIA picks up this data, this type of data. What again do the tables show? And we clearly, Mr. Williams, we've had a number of people who have come along to the inquiry and have said that they are highly annoyed. There's no disputing that. Here is an estimate of numbers. So what's shown here? What does this tell us about the proposal and its effect?
I think, as you allude to, it does obviously acknowledge that some people are highly annoyed and highly sleep disturbed by both current operations and future operations. And the numbers essentially follow the same trend as in the tables I've just discussed, in that they are higher with 12 million than 10 million in 2030 by a relatively small amount.
And you told us how the highly annoyed are calculated. It's approximately 9% of the overall population. What about the highly sleep disturbed? How's that calculated?
Just to clarify, it's not 9% of the overall population. That was just an example of at a specific noise level.
Sorry, I meant the overall population within the contours, as I understand it.
It's within one of the contours, so it's a higher percentage at the higher noise levels, for example. And highly sleep disturbed is calculated in a similar way. Essentially, a smaller percentage of people at lower noise levels are highly sleep disturbed, and a higher percentage at higher noise levels.
Let's just then move on to understand the supplementary metrics. Why are supplementary metrics used? We know from the APF and many other documents there's a
recommendation to produce them. What are they useful for?
As I think we touched on before, I think the main use of them is to aid understanding of the effects for the public and to better illustrate what might be changing as a result of the proposals.
And the ES Addendum appendix produces actually data on a very, very large number of different supplementary metrics. So I'm going to confine myself to just some of the principal ones. So firstly, two of them, SEL and Lmax, are actually slightly different metrics. Perhaps you could just very briefly explain to the inspectors that they're similar metric, but what's the difference between SEL and Lmax?
So Lmax is probably the easiest to understand, as in it's literally just the highest noise level when the plane goes past. SEL is the noise. This is it's a measure of the total noise energy of the plane going past, and that's generally accepted to be a slightly better indicator for aircraft. It's also used for trains, for example, because it takes into account how long the event is. And a useful example is propeller aircraft, for example. They tend to travel slower than jet aircraft, so the people are exposed to the noise for longer and sometimes find them more annoying for the same maximum noise level.
So if we want to understand, using these types of metrics, the difference between, for example, different aircraft types, can we just look at that? There's a document, I'm excited to say, with a different CD number, CD 3.4.5. CD 3.4.5, which was some supplementary data that was, some supplementary data that was submitted, and we turn to PDF page 45. And we've got there some contours for SEL contours for a runway 27 departure, so a departure to the west for two different aircraft types, the Boeing 737 and then the Boeing 737 MAX. We have the contour plots for the SELs. Just explain to the inspectors what the two plots show. If we're to use SELs as a supplementary metric in order to help people understand things, what does it show?
So this figure compares the two aircraft. So one of the benefits of showing that is that it demonstrates the benefits of the new aircraft. And clearly you can see the 738 MAX, the blue lines are smaller than the red lines, indicating that that aircraft is quieter than the one it's going to replace.
And we've heard various people talk about new aircraft and noise getting quieter. Do the SELs help us understand that or quantify that?
I think they do. Essentially it's showing that a smaller area and therefore number of people would be exposed to the same noise level by the quieter aircraft.
And if we go back to one of our documents we have looked at a lot, CD 2.20.4, and look at page 64. And again, we have some similar types of data for, it's not a comparison between two aircraft types, but this is the Airbus 321 Neo, and its SEL contours for arrivals and departures on either easterlies or westerlies on the runway. Again, how does this help us understand effects if one's trying to explain things to people and give an additional layer of explanation to the LEQ contours? What's this telling us?
So I think the reason for this figure is that obviously the addendum was updating information from the ES, so we didn't represent all of the SEL contours, but the 321 Neo was one of the aircraft that we updated the noise information for because we had new measurements that we didn't have before. And it's, as you say, showing the 4 different operations that it might do, as in arrival or departure in each direction. And essentially the people within those contours are exposed to a level of 90 SEL, which we'd rated as a significant absolute level. And I think this was an aircraft that in some of the situations was the noisiest aircraft that happened at least once per night.
And if one turns to the next page, one gets the Boeing 737 MAX 8, and you can see its equivalent criteria there, and one can understand the effects of different aircraft types in relation to noise. Is that?
Yes, so you can clearly see the 737 MAX is likely to be quieter.
And again, if one wants to understand overall numbers, one can see that from the supplementary metric. If one goes back to CD 2.20.1, we go to page 74, PDF page 74, table 6.12. It's the table at the bottom of that page. And again, what does that show us for both the 90 SEL and the 80 Lmax?
So this is an assessment of the number of dwellings, I think, that were exposed to those levels at least once per night. And as you can see, although it looks like it will go up from now, it's not something that's going to change with or without the development. Essentially, it depends how well the future aircraft perform, exactly how many people it will be, but that's our best estimate at the moment.
And what does this tell us about, as over time the fleet mix changes, not just 2030, but 2031, 2032, 2033, 34, the fleet mix moves to the more modern aircraft? What will happen?
Clearly, if the aircraft that is causing that event gets withdrawn and replaced by a quieter aircraft, then the number of people affected would go down.
Okay.
It's in general, aircraft don't normally get noisier over time, or certainly not in recent history.
And one can see in that table the 80 LAS MAX. I haven't really been asking about contours and things for that, but if one was to use that particular supplementary metric, again, would the overall conclusions be different from what that we just discussed for SEL?
No, it's the same relationship.
And so does the use of this supplementary metric cause you to change the assessment of significant effects, EIA significant effects, from the conclusions that you drew using LAQ, either 16-hour day or 8-hour night in relation to, as I say, change your conclusions in relation to significance of effects?
No, it doesn't change the conclusions. I mean, if the potential to change conclusions would be if there was a change between with and without development. Clearly, there's not, so there's no effect, as it were.
If we move to N70 and N60, and again, the inquiry has been taken quite extensively to what ICANN says and what SONA says, so perhaps we can pass over that. But I just want to go back to that point that we discussed before. The N70 data and the N60 data is that representing the same frequency and type of events as the LAQ data?
Yes, they're different outputs from the same module that has the same inputs.
And we know that the correlation with community response is slightly better for LAEQ, and in that context, can we just look then at the output from the model for those things? And we need to look at your rebuttal, don't we? So your rebuttal evidence, pages 6 and 7. Firstly, just to ask you about the N70 and the N60. The N70 is obviously events above 70 dB LA max, and the N60 above 60 dB LA max. Are those thresholds, 70 for day and 60 for night, are those thresholds of significance, EIA significance?
No, there's nothing in the EIA context that would say that exceeding 70 specifically would be significant. The important thing would be what changes between the two different scenarios that you're looking at.
And in the tables, you've again represented the numbers of events in 10, 20, 50, 100, 200. Is there anything that tells us exceeding a certain number of events is significant in EIA terms?
So this would presumably relate to whether you could use it to set a load or a cell. And as far as I'm aware, for N70, there's not any accepted criteria such as the 63 dB LEQ that might be accepted as a cell. It has the N60 at night has been related to having 10 to 15 events of 45 indoors, which is broadly equivalent to what might be considered a lull. And I think that the results are reasonably consistent with the number of people we say are above the lull based on the LEQ contours.
Yes. So again, we can look at this data, which is presenting exactly the same number of movements, same aircraft types doing the same things, just presenting it in a different way. Does it cause you to change
your assessment of the significance of effects for daytime noise and nighttime noise based on the LAQ 16 and 8-hour data?
No, I mean, as I said before, they're trying to measure the same thing, and the research shows that LEQ does that better, so that's what you should use to determine the effects.
Then, just moving to something slightly different, awakenings, which, in a sense, awakening is not a metric, but I'm just considering it along with metrics. Is there any policy requirement to calculate awakenings?
No.
I think that there's a fair amount of common ground between you and Mr. Fumicelli about the concept of awakenings. I think his paragraph 420 and 421 makes the point that awakenings doesn't mean people are fully awake, and that there are many awakenings, nothing to do with noise, many awakenings a night, on average I think 24 awakenings a night. In that context, you were asked to urge by Mr. Fumicelli to carry out what's called a BASNA calculation based on the BASNA research papers, and you did that. Can you just explain to the inspectors what that was, what you did? I think this is again in your rebuttal, isn't it? Section 4 of your rebuttal. You carried out a BASNA assessment. Again, just explain to the inspectors what you did. There was an issue that was raised about windows being open at night for 25% of the time. Why is that?
Yeah, I think there's a few different points you've touched on there. Firstly, I think we are agreed on what constitutes an awakening. It's a technical definition that's used by the research, that you don't have to be fully alert and awake for it to constitute an awakening. But yeah, so the awakening metric, essentially, it's Basner has done a lot of research, and his most recent research in 2018 gives a formula that you use the Lmax value inside to calculate your probability that you'll be awakened by an individual aircraft event. Clearly, what we get out of our model is the external noise level, and not every property is the same. Obviously, you don't always have the same relationship from outside to inside. There's not kind of a standard way that people have approached this assessment. It's only been done sporadically that I'm aware of. I've seen most assessments I have seen have used kind of a blanket adjustment of, I think, 21 or 22 dB that's based on the WHO guidance of the average you might get over a year, kind of allowing for windows being open some of the time and closed some of the time, because it's an annual metric. So clearly in the winter you wouldn't expect people to have their windows open all of the time, and equally it would be unfair to assume that they're always going to be closed. So I felt it was important to allow for the fact that they'd be open some of the time and closed some of the time.
And you tell us, your paragraph 4.1.8, that based on his research, Basner recommended that one should avoid being exposed to at least one additional awakening due to aircraft noise per night on average over a year, so 365 of these sort of technical awakenings per year. And what did your application of the BASNA methodology to the data we have for Bristol, what did that show?
So we looked at essentially the people with the highest Lmax levels, so those most likely to be above this threshold. And there was only one where we found that they were above that threshold, and that was the case for both with and without the development. And
what about all the other locations that you assessed?
So all the others were below the threshold, obviously. And the locations that we didn't assess, we would expect to be lower still.
So again, using that, taking it as a supplementary metric or a supplementary piece of information, does that again cause you to change your assessment of the significance of effects from those that you drew for nighttime using the LAQ 8-hour assessment?
No, and I think Mr. Fumicelli broadly agreed with this, that obviously there are more awakenings with the development than without, but that there's nobody that is exposed to any significant change due to that.
So I'm going to move on now from air noise just to briefly deal with ground noise. And the issue here, I suppose, relates to the proposal that aircraft on certain of the stands don't have to be towed on, towed off. They can use their auxiliary power to get onto stand. I think Mr. Fumicelli, I think slightly flippantly called it keeping drinks cold. I don't think that's perhaps quite fair, but whatever it is, just explain what this is and the concepts of fixed electrical ground power and what it is that is being assessed in a sense in the ground noise assessment.
Yeah, so the ground noise assessment essentially starts from when the aircraft lands. Once they get down to taxiing speed, it takes into account the noise level while they're taxiing, at which point they'll still have the main aircraft engines on. And then once they get near to the stands, once they get near to the stands, they then turn on what's called the APU, which allows essential operations that need to be on the aircraft, such as ventilation and things like that, that obviously in the short term you can get away without it, but if they end up being there a long time, you don't want there not to be any ventilation on the aircraft. It basically means they can turn the engines off. And so they're the two main elements that go into ground noise, being the taxiing obviously moves around the airport and the APU largely happens on or very close to the stands.
So let's look down at the ground noise contours and the ground noise table. So the ground noise contours, we need to go to CD 2.20.4 and PDF page 68, and that's the one in the style that we've been doing them, which is 10 MPPA in 2030. And that's a daytime, that's a 16-hour daytime contour there, and you can see on page 68 what the 10 MPPA daytime contour is. On the next page the 12 MPPA contour, and then the next two pages, PDF page 70, 71, are the equivalent 8-hour contours. And again, just get you to comment what what are the contours showing us?
Well, they show obviously the different noise levels and to what extent people will be exposed to them. And I think if you comparing the two scenarios, it's not quite as straightforward as the air noise, because there's a new walkway that's being built as part of the application, which gives screening to some people to the northeast of the airport along Downside Road. So in that particular area, they're actually better off under 12 million. But for most people, there's a small increase in noise associated with the increase in aircraft movements.
And I think we can see that effect. So because of the screening, some people become better off and some people slightly worse off. If we turn to page 42 of the same document. And I think it's table 6A.68, isn't it?
Yes.
There's so many tables, I'm just trying to make sure I haven't got this right. So that's dwellings exposed to absolute noise and changing noise, 10 mppa 2030 to 12 mppa 2030. And again, we can see within different thresholds. So at the Lowell, we can see that actually a number of people get, as it's described at the top, moderate or substantial beneficial effects. Why is that?
So that's the effect that I was just trying to describe. Essentially, there's a new walkway being built that gives screening from the airport, and that can have quite a substantial change in the noise level, which would far outweigh the increase due to the more flights for those people.
And I think it shows us there's one person that has an adverse effect over Seoul, and that's within the range 0 to 1 dB.
0 to 2 dB, I think, yes.
0 to 2 dB. And again, in terms of significance of effect, how would one characterize that? Firstly, for the adverse effects, is there a significant adverse effect?
No, there's not.
What about beneficial effect?
Yes, we would regard those as significant.
Because
it's a moderate or substantial change in noise level.
And let's just come then on to the very last topic, conditions and mitigation. And I'm keen not to go too much into this because I know there'll be a discussion at some point, but perhaps we can just characterize the main headings where there are noise conditions that may be that we will be discussing. So currently the daytime contour, I think during the discussions with officers, they pre the determination of the application, they proposed a daytime contour 75, 57 dB contour of 11.5 dB.
11.5 kilometres squared, yes.
Sorry, 11.5 kilometres squared. And I think Mr. Fumicelli said he's seeking something that goes down to 10.7, which is the ESA contour in 2030.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's obviously matter to be discussed. Nighttime contour, there's not one at the moment, but what's being proposed there?
I think as my understanding is there's an offer that, as part of the appeal process, that there'll be a limit of 6.8 kilometres squared, which is what was forecast in the ESA court case for 55 dB.
The QC scheme, there is currently a QC scheme, but again, just very light touch, just outline what is being proposed, how that's being changed.
Yeah, just very briefly on the QC scheme, just to try and explain it. I'm not sure it came out before, but the noise levels that go into it are based on the certification noise levels of the aircraft, so they're not based on measurements at the airport. But there's the changes to it are the change in resolution from 3 dB to 1 dB that's already been discussed, and there's currently an allowance to have some flexibility to share the limit between the summer and the winter, and that's going to be phased out over the next few years. But the total budget allowed is unchanged.
And then the movement limit during the QC period?
So that's, again, has been discussed. It's currently 3,000 in the summer and 1,000 in the winter, and that's proposed to change to 4,000 for 2 consecutive seasons.
Noisiest permitted aircraft at night, what's proposed there?
So currently an aircraft with a QC of 2 is the maximum that's allowed to operate at night, and that's being proposed to reduce to 1. So essentially they have to be 3 dB quieter is at the maximum level.
Numbers of flights in the shoulder period, what's proposed there?
So again, this is currently they're permitted to have 10,500 annual flights in what's known as the shoulder periods, which is the half an hour at the start and an hour at the end of the night period that's not in the QC. And that's been offered to reduce to 9,500, and that was offered as part of the application, not just the appeal.
Then ground noise, we looked at the assessment. We know that there is fixed electrical ground power. It can't always be used. Mr. Funicelli made that point entirely correctly. But what did your assessment assume?
So yeah, we, as Mr. Funicelli said, if what we call FEGP, fixed electrical ground power, is used, the noise levels will be much lower and not noticeable outside the airport. However, there's not reliable information that we had on how much it is used, so we made the conservative assumption that it's never used, which is the worst case.
Then the noise insulation scheme, we know from the airport policy framework that that talks about a threshold of 63 dB and a 3 dB change.
Yes, although the 3 dB change has been removed by later policy.
Absolutely. And again, what is proposed at the airport?
So, as currently, the threshold for eligibility for the installation scheme in the daytime is 57 dB, although the airport are proposing to increase what people can get once they are eligible, and in particular remove the requirement to match what they get with their own money.
Mr. Williams, I think as far as I'm concerned that covers everything, and I apologise for going over my original estimate, but I think I'm within my revised estimate.
Yes, you
Thank
are.
you.
Yes, only a little bit of extra time there, Mr. Humphreys, so
Thank
thank you
you
for that. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Just on the conditions issue, obviously discussions are going on, so I think if you can keep me just informed, because it'll help my preparations for next Friday, which is when the condition session will be, please.
Yes, I simply sort of don't know at the moment. It doesn't mean that things aren't happening. I just don't know what is or is not happening, or what is proposed. But I know both parties are very willing to try and meet to sort things out.
Yeah, I mean, if the session's Friday, you know, Thursday lunchtime, if there's going to be any new sets of wording or anything like that, that would be helpful, just to let me have some sleep on Thursday night, I suppose, to prepare. Okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody. An early finish, but you'll be back next week, Mr. Williams, for cross-examination. Are there any procedural matters we need to raise here today before we finish? No. Lots of shakes of head. Good. Okay, thank you. Mr. Ware, anything? No? Okay, well, we shall adjourn to restart next Tuesday at 9:30. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.